high-flying couple and their boy genius, living the American dream.
That's the way it appeared on the outside.
Until one family member begins lusting for more than money.
There's nothing worse than infidelity.
Our hunch was right. There's someone else.
They say greed is the root of all evil. But it's another sin that'll take this family down.
The force that had to have been used was tremendous.
This is a crime of passion. This is somebody who went to great extent to kill.
Welcome to Coral Gables, Florida, a gated community in the heart of Miami, where Mediterranean-styled villas overlook the sands of the American Riviera.
Coral Gables, it's better known as the City Beautiful. Mostly affluent, tree-lined, beautiful houses. The nicest part of Miami to live in.
It has parks, it has museums, it has colleges. Coral Gables is a lovely place to raise a family.
It's the kind of place where going overboard means splurging on a yacht, not murdering your loved ones. Living in the lap of luxury. Every day's like Christmas for the Locasios. But now, Yuletide's here for real, and the whole family is decking the halls together. Ed has good reason to be in a jolly mood.
Ed Locasio is a pillar of the community. He's a very well-known accountant and respected businessman. He coaches Little League games, so everybody knows him and admires him.
Managing money for Miami Beach millionaires is a high-pressure shell game. Definitely not for the squeamish. Thankfully, Ed's never minded shedding a little blood on the path to success.
He was hardworking, ambitious, smart, very effective accountant.
He was self-made. He went to school, he got his degree, and he opened his firm, and he was worth in the vicinity of $15 million.
A fortune that would attract a bevy of Coral Gables wannabe trophy wives. But for 20 years, the only woman under Ed's mistletoe has been his wife, Maggie, a Cuban-born beauty with brains to match.
Maggie and Ed met while they were young CPAs. They were both attractive, very intelligent. She was very driven. She got a degree in accounting, and then she got her master's degree.
Yet Maggie also has a softer side.
People absolutely adore and love Maggie. She's just so warm and loving.
Maggie is the yin to Ed's yang. It's hard to imagine one reaching the top without the other. Once their accounting firm was rolling, Maggie embarked on a new venture.
Instead of becoming a professional career person, she decided to let her career take a back seat and raise her son, Ed Jr.
Maggie and Ed's only child, 19-year-old Eddie Jr., is the jewel in the Locasio crown.
Ed Jr. is not only smart, he is super smart. He's practically a boy genius.
Both his parents pushed him to succeed in school. He was driven himself. He wanted to succeed.
And when there's a problem, this wise man is quick to think up a solution.
He was a very, very intelligent child. He was extremely academically advanced. In fact, he graduated from college early at 19 years old and started medical school immediately.
Eddie Jr. has his sights set on becoming a pediatrician. A real do-gooder. While some young men would resent a strict, academically focused childhood, Eddie Jr. has always been an angel. Life for the Locasios seems as orderly as Ed's balance sheets. But every family tree has a twisted twig. In this case, it's Ed's younger brother, Michael.
Michael Locasio, he was the black sheep of the family.
Maggie's never been a fan of Michael's presence.
Maggie being super intelligent and Michael being not so intelligent. She might not think Michael has that great an influence on her son. He's just not wired the same way.
Michael was a guy that was working menial jobs. Maggie felt that he was one of these people that was always looking for a scam, always looking for a way to make easy money.
Ed's bad news brother often blows through town, usually with his hand out. Though Maggie doesn't know it, her husband always coughs up some cash.
Ed was successful, Michael was not. Ed thought he deserved a little bit more.
But that's not the only secret involving Ed's wallet. As Maggie will soon find out, the biggest threat to her family comes from outside the home. An ordinary afternoon at their favorite cafe starts innocently enough. Until Ed steps away to settle the bill. But there will soon be a steeper price to pay. A business card from a massage parlor?
Maggie starts having some suspicions.
Is her husband secretly seeing a masseuse to ease his tight muscles? Or is it much more than that? Maggie's diamond-studded world is losing its sparkle, but she doesn't confront Ed with her suspicions. Instead, she transforms from happy housewife to seething snoop. Ed Locasio's every move is now watched from the shadows. Turns out he's been hiding a sexy secret.
So she hires a private investigator, and her hunch was right. There's someone else.
The PI captures every wife's worst nightmare. Ed has been docking his yacht in a foreign harbor.
Ed had a girlfriend. That girlfriend's name was Eleanor. She was a masseuse that he had met.
Eleanor was very beautiful, very exotic. Lest we mention young, very young, younger than Maggie, of course.
And with that, life for the Locasios will soon be spiraling out of control. Maggie plays nice for the holidays, but her warm smile is about to be replaced by a devilish grin. She knows Ed's been more naughty than nice. but she's not about to give him the upper hand.
The fact that Ed is carrying on an affair really rankles Maggie. She's a pillar of the community. Everybody looks up to her, and he's carrying on with a masseuse.
And what does Maggie have for her dear, devoted hubby?
What do you think, honey? Do you like it?
Maybe that was the one thing that just triggered her saying, look, I've put up with enough of your BS and I don't need this anymore.
Do you understand? I want you gone. She just couldn't handle it anymore. Ed was forced to move out of their marital home in Coral Gables.
Of course, for a man like Ed, being kicked to the curb means a luxury bachelor pad.
Ed moved into a condo in Miami South Beach, which is a very nice area.
Little does this sugar daddy suspect. Eviction is only part one of Maggie's revenge. The once esteemed Locascio family is headed for a dirty war that will soon reap some deadly returns.
A person gets to the point where enough is enough. Everybody's got their breaking point.
Up next, the Locascio mansion's spotless tile floors are speckled red with blood. For the Locascio family, this holiday season has been decidedly short of goodwill toward men. Husband Ed's infidelity may break Maggie's heart, but she's pulling no punches. The jilted wife calls for a meeting with lawyers.
Maggie is so incensed by this affair that she demands a divorce. And Ed Sr. probably thought, why?
Ed was furious when Maggie wanted to divorce him. Not only was this woman that should have loved him wanting to leave him, she wanted half his money.
In the state of Florida, you basically split everything in half. All the monies that were earned during the marriage are split in half. And then there's a determination as to whether there ought to be child support. And I don't believe that was an issue here because Ed Jr. was old enough. And then there was the issue of alimony.
Maggie spent a lot of years in school. She has a master's degree. She helped build that business from the ground up. Florida's a 50-50 state. Why shouldn't she be entitled to 50% of everything that she contributed? Plus, she's had to put up with Ed all these years. That alone is worth 50% of the $6 million.
While the divorce proceedings are ongoing, Ed is forced to support his estranged wife. But Maggie smells a rat.
The judge ordered Ed to pay Maggie alimony, and he was supposed to pay it on a monthly basis. He did pay it, but he paid it out of their joint account. And she was a CPA with a master's degree. She was a very intelligent woman, and she had to help him set up the business. So she knew he was hiding money, and she set out to find where he hid it. And she did. She was very bright. When the judge found out about this, he didn't like it. So he froze their assets and told Ed that he had to pay her out of his earnings.
That is where Ed draws a line in the sand.
Edward had made comments to people that she wasn't going to get a penny from him.
Your client is a liar.
It was basically Ed saying, wait a second, I ain't giving you nothing. And now the war starts.
Both the Locasios are regulars on the Miami social scene. And that's where the next phase of this battle plays out.
Ed wanted to parade his beautiful mistress in front of his wife. He wanted to get even, to make her hurt.
What a tangled web has been weaved. Dysfunction is not even the word to use here. It was just a convoluted web of just insecurities and hurt and betrayal. You could cut the tension with a knife.
Maggie refuses to back down.
Instead of being humiliated, Maggie was angrier and thought, I am going to get even.
Tension is at an all-time high. And dark days are coming. Around 10 p.m. on a quiet night, a tripped burglar alarm sends police scrambling to one of the ritziest addresses in Coral Gables, the Locasio compound.
Coral Gables Police Department got there within 4 or 5 minutes at the most.
The first officer who arrived on the scene went up to the door that he saw slightly ajar.
They press on, not knowing if they're alone, looking for signs of burglary. But what they find cuts much deeper.
It was extremely bloody and violent.
A female body, butchered and brutalized.
There was blood all over. There were bloody fingerprints. There was a bloody footprint.
So they secured the scene, stepped out and called the Miami-Dade Police Homicide Bureau.
Detectives quickly recognized the victim as one of Coral Gables' best-known socialites, Maggie Locasio. She has been severely beaten and stabbed multiple times.
The murder scene was horrific. Maggie was virtually just cold-bloodedly slaughtered.
Her feet underneath were bloody, indicating that she was alive and struggling while she was being murdered.
She fought very bravely to try and maintain her life. I mean, she was stabbed several times. She had put up her hands in defense and was stabbed so badly on one finger that one finger was almost completely severed off. That still didn't kill Maggie because she was still fighting back. And at some point, you could tell that the intruder stomped on her chest several times to make sure that she was no longer breathing.
Piecing the clues together, it looks like Maggie was surprised in the middle of making dinner.
She started to cook. She actually put oil in a pan. Then she was attacked in the kitchen.
In a nearby hallway, they find a blood-soaked baton called an asp.
An asp is a metal rod. When you snap it out, it lengthens to maybe 2 or 3 feet. And it's used as a striking tool. This tool was lying on the floor.
The asp that was found on the scene had a ridged handle, which allowed for DNA collection. There was also a glove found on the floor. There was blood all over the tile floor as well.
Seems the killer left a wealth of evidence behind. But one thing is missing: Maggie's purse.
First thing you gotta ask yourself, why was this crime committed. You could say it was committed for robbery, or it was a burglary gone bad.
Or could it be something even more sinister?
It is a bloodbath. It's not the work of someone just trying to kill someone. It's someone expressing rage.
Coming up, the Locascio boy genius surprises investigators, and a grisly goodie bag adds to the macabre mystery. Crime scene technicians in Coral Gables, Florida, are processing the mansion of newly deceased Maggie Locascio when an unexpected visitor arrives.
Eddie Locascio, Maggie's son, arrived on the scene. Of course, we stopped him. We had the scene roped off, and we talked to him.
The heir to the Locascio throne seems unruffled. Detectives cannot let the young man into his home while it's still an active crime scene. Instead, they ask him down to the station for a little chat. So where was the med student at the time of the murder? Eddie says he was tucked away on campus.
He was in a biology lab working late with a professor. Because of that, we didn't make it home until after 10 o'clock.
Eddie says he isn't surprised his mom's been murdered.
Eddie said something to the effect of that finally killed her.
The investigator was like, "Who are you talking about?" And he was like, "Ed Locascio, my father."
The young man then paints a chilling picture of his father as an emotional bully and tyrant.
Ed was a successful businessman. He had been extremely successful both in starting his own business and also in making investments. He was arrogant. He felt superior.
Eddie Jr. was not a big fan of his father because his father didn't support him and didn't care for him and treated him badly.
Ed Locascio Sr. was into sports and tried to encourage his son to get into sports as well, but his son was not one of those sports kids. So there was that friction.
Detectives cover their bases with Junior and take a DNA sample. The swab is sent to the lab for testing as investigators shift their focus. Big Ed Locascio has to be considered the #1 suspect. They invite the patriarch in for questioning. There, he sees a once friendly face.
They were taken out of the interview rooms and just by happenstance crossed each other's path in the hallway in the police station. Ed looked up and saw Eddie. Eddie just looked at him and I think shook his head and didn't say anything.
It's a very awkward moment because you would think Ed Sr. would say something to his son to console him. He's just lost his mother in the most brutal way imaginable. And Ed Jr. just walks right by. The police are just baffled. Can you imagine when they witness this awkward moment, this disconnect between Senior and Junior? The father and son walk right by each other with blank looks on their face. And all that Senior can say is, "You okay?" Like it was some minor thing, like he'd just fallen off a bicycle and skinned his knee as a child. I'm sure police made note of that. This was one dysfunctional family.
When Ed sits down with detectives to discuss his estranged wife's murder, it becomes clear that calm and collected demeanors run in the family.
No reaction at all. Not any sign of breaking down, crying, being upset, being mad, anger, nothing. blank stare.
An attempt was made to talk to him. However, he had an attorney and did not wish to talk about the case.
The accountant is open about his divorce disputes, but vehemently denies killing his wife. His alibi is simple.
He was home. He was in his apartment.
Furthermore, Ed has suspicions of his own.
Edward was pointing the finger at his son, Eddie, as being the murderer in this case.
Police treat father like son and take a DNA swab before cutting Ed loose. It's a mind-blowing game of he said, with the entire Locascio fortune on the line. Back at the murder scene, the time has come to pound the pavement.
The area is completely residential, and the neighbors were very attentive to the things happening in their neighborhood.
Seems one of these well-to-dos spotted a suspicious white pickup truck the night before.
He did note that the vehicle was driving kind of in a general away direction from where the Locascio home was.
Working this angle, investigators get a lucky break.
The neighbor called, and they lived 2 blocks from the scene, right across the street from where these neighbors saw this truck acting suspiciously.
The neighbor tells them the driver of the truck tossed a duffel bag out the window into the bushes. Inside, a treasure trove of evidence.
In the bag, the police found latex gloves. They found a knife with blood on it. They found bloody clothes. And they also found Maggie's credit cards. So robbery wasn't the motive behind the murder.
This was a killing for killing's sake, and police already appear to have 2 persons of interest. Investigators are convinced that between the DNA samples and the fresh cache of evidence dripping in blood, at least one of the Locascios might soon be arrested for murder. But there's another person out there, Ed's mistress, Eleanor, who might have much to gain from Maggie's death. Solving this case will turn out to be more difficult than anyone could have imagined.
Of course, police test the DNA found at the crime scene. When the results come back, Ed Sr. test negative.
A surveillance camera at Ed's bachelor pad further bolsters his claim of innocence.
Those video cameras did show that he was in and out of the building at the time of the murder and could not have possibly committed the crime.
Ed had an ironclad alibi.
Could Maggie's son, Eddie Jr., be involved in some way? Here again, the DNA test results they're hoping to match the bag of evidence come back negative. Strike 2. Still, the killer has to be close.
This is a crime of passion. This is not somebody that Maggie walked in on a burglar and he was trying to escape. This is somebody who wanted her dead and went to great extent to kill her.
Everyone knows at least one woman out there who may have wanted Maggie out of the picture. Ed Locascio's mistress, Eleanor. But Eleanor's whereabouts on the night of the murder only bolster Ed's alibi.
Where was Eleanor the night of Maggie's murder? She was at Ed's condo in South Miami Beach.
Once again, the condo surveillance camera proves pivotal.
The camera indicated that he was in the condo with his mistress at the time of the murder.
Detectives can't help but feel they're spinning their wheels until Ed's former secretary comes forward with a new intriguing take on Coral Gables' supposedly mild-mannered accountant.
A coworker overheard a phone conversation with Ed.
The secretary claims shortly before the murder, her boss said something outrageous. And it had to do with his estranged wife, Maggie, as well as his brother, Michael.
At one point, Ed said to his secretary, "My brother's crazy. He told me that if he killed the nobody would find out about it."
She was kind of shocked and thought better of than to answer any other way. You know, she didn't want to kind of engage him in that conversation, but she always remembered it.
Police asked why she didn't come forward with that information, and she said, "Oh, that's Ed. He's always saying stuff like that."
Detectives are definitely intrigued by the secretary's story. They pay brother Michael Locascio a surprise visit. And their interests are piqued by what they find in his driveway.
Michael has a pickup.
This pickup truck matches the vehicle spotted fleeing the scene. And that's not all.
The cab of the truck was stripped out. The seat cushions were taken off. Any type of materials that were on the metal walls of the truck was removed.
Maybe Michael doesn't mind a bumpy ride. Or maybe he ditched the seats because they were soaked in his sister-in-law's blood.
The truck was actually washed out with a hose. There was actually water still in the truck when it was found.
During questioning, Ed's wayward brother does little to allay investigators' suspicions.
Michael denied being in Florida at the time. Later on, he actually said that he had an alibi, that he was in Florida, but he was at a restaurant on Miami Beach.
Detectives obtain a warrant to collect Michael's DNA. When the results come back, surprise, surprise, police have found their match.
His DNA is in the bag inside the latex glove. It's on the knife and also Maggie's credit card.
It was pretty clear cut that he was the murderer.
The clues point to Michael, but there's one problem. He has no apparent motive.
Michael Locascio didn't come out of the blue and murder Maggie for nothing.
And there are three people who may have a lot to gain from Maggie's murder. Could Michael's brother Ed have masterminded the murder of his estranged wife to avoid a costly divorce? Did Michael's nephew, Eddie Jr., inherit a fortune thanks to his uncle's fatal favor? Or did Maggie's bitter rival, Eleanor, orchestrate the whole thing? Turns out the key to unraveling this family conspiracy has been sitting in front of police the whole time.
If he had thought ahead of time, he should have said, after the murder, "Don't come looking for me. There's a camera there, and you'll be caught."
Coming up, a security camera reveals more than meets the eye. Police in Coral Gables, Florida, have arrested Michael Locascio for the murder of his sister-in-law, Maggie. But there's oh so much more to the story.
Michael really wouldn't have a motive to kill Maggie. But he was the weapon. He had the brutal force and strength to kill her. The question is, who put him up to it?
Maggie's son, Eddie Jr., her husband, Ed, and Ed's lover, Eleanor, all may have had something to gain from Maggie's untimely death. The murder suspect isn't talking, but investigators think they can find the puppet master by digging into bank records.
Michael is one of these people that couldn't hold down a job. One of those guys always looking for a way to make easy money at the expense of other people and with lies and deceit.
A sudden surge of cash would certainly suggest a conspiracy. But to investigators' surprise, Hard Luck Michael appears to be broke as ever.
There was no withdrawal or transaction from the bank accounts. There were no suitcases with dollar bills in them.
Michael Locascio still doesn't have 2 nickels to rub together. But in their hunt for funding, detectives find something fishy in the family phone records.
Michael and Ed's relationship had changed or blossomed since the time of the murder.
Ed had been in phone contact with his brother a lot in the last couple of weeks. They were 39 phone calls.
And directly before the murder, the calls were coming on a daily basis, a drastic change from their normal routine.
Usually they would call each other on their birthdays or holidays and didn't spend a lot of time with each other at all.
Stranger still, the calls between the victim's estranged husband and his killer brother stopped the day after the murder.
That specifically was one of our strongest pieces of evidence, showing the change of relationship between Michael and Ed.
Michael's motivation to kill Maggie could only have come from his brother.
Investigators are now locked on the dead woman's husband and pore over the video evidence with fresh eyes.
Ed Sr. had an airtight alibi. The video surveillance camera at the condo where he lived did, in fact, show him buzzing in.
But letting it play on, detectives see there's even more to the story.
Ironically, that same surveillance camera showed his brother Michael at 11:40 p.m.
It shows Michael going there and repeatedly buzzing, trying to get into the condo. The video shows that Michael's shirt was sopping wet.
He washed his truck out before he got to Miami Beach. And so that's where the wet spot came from. He was going right from the scene where he committed this horrendous murder directly to his brother Edward's apartment.
It's all there in grainy black and white. Police have finally made their case.
It's so ironic that the one thing that Ed thought would save him did him in at the end.
Edward was the one behind this homicide, and Michael was just the one who pulled the trigger.
Ed Locascio is arrested for first-degree murder. With the writing on the wall, the brothers finally give in and tell all.
When Maggie went home that evening, she drove into the garage.
She got out of the car, she went into the house. Meanwhile, right outside the garage is a little wall. It's very dark in that area, and Michael slipped in beside her car. And then Maggie went upstairs in her house and she set her alarm. From there goes into the kitchen.
And he started beating her with a metal baton.
It was a very violent attack on a defenseless woman.
With his sister-in-law dead on the floor, Michael does everything he can to clean up all of the evidence. But in his haste, he fails to take the most critical items. On his way out, Michael grabs Maggie's credit cards to make it look like a robbery, before accidentally triggering the burglar alarm. Spooked, Michael tosses the green duffel bag full of evidence out the window and retreats to his older brother's condo. It was a brutal beating. Carried out by the one family member with nothing left to lose. Orchestrated by the one person who had the most to lose.
It was bits and pieces that brought together make the guilt of Ed clear. It wasn't one or two links. It was many, many links that made the chain strong.
The emotional impact of this is greed. The greed of Edward Locascio, because Edward didn't have to do this.
At trial, Ed Locascio is found guilty of first-degree murder. Ditto for Michael. Both are sentenced to life behind bars. Ed's mistress, Eleanor, and son, Eddie Jr., had no involvement in the homicide.
There's a slim possibility that Ed, at some point in the future, will realize that he really messed up. But right now, he's still really arrogant, and he doesn't think he did anything wrong.
In the aftermath of Maggie Locaccio's murder, the millionaires and billionaires that populate Coral Gables have mostly...
On the night of June 17, 2015, Charleston seemed to be holding itself together in the careful way old cities often do after sunset, with the heat easing off the brick, the air turning soft over Calhoun Street, and the church steeples standing against the dark like promises that had survived every century before this one. Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, known across Charleston and far beyond it as Mother Emanuel, had stood through generations of fear and endurance, carrying inside its walls a history older than most of the grief that had ever tried to bury it. It was not simply a church in the ordinary sense. It was a witness. It was memory made visible. Founded in the early 19th century, tied to the long struggle for black worship free from white control, marked by harassment, fire, rebuilding, and survival. It had become one of the most important black churches in the South, a place where faith and history sat side by side in the pews. Its pastor in 2015, Reverend Clementa Pinckney, was also a state senator, a man whose public life and pastoral life met in that sanctuary the way they had for other leaders before him. Inside Mother Emanuel that evening, a Bible study was beginning in the ordinary rhythm that makes sacred places feel safe. People came carrying the weather of their own day with them, the private fatigue of work, the ache in their knees, the errands unfinished, the small talk exchanged in a fellowship hall or on a church step, And then they settled into Scripture, into prayer, into the ritual of being known by others. It was a Wednesday, the kind of midweek night that does not announce itself as history while it is happening. It was quiet enough that no one would have expected the city to split open before the hour was over. National Park Service warned the danger did not arrive in the shape most people fear. It did not crash through a door snarling. It did not wear its intentions on its face so plainly that everyone in the room could rise and run. It came in politely. It came and seated among them. It came carrying the oldest poison in American life and dressed it in stillness. A 21-year-old white supremacist entered the church that evening and joined the Bible study. Sitting among black parishioners who did what people in houses of worship have done for generations when a stranger appears at the door. They welcomed him into the circle. They made room. They allowed him to belong for an hour. That detail is one of the unbearable truths of the story. Before the violence, there was hospitality. Before the blood, there was mercy. Before the hatred showed its teeth, it was given a chair. The scripture discussed that evening was the kind of scripture that asks what takes root in the human heart and what withers there. Round him were men and women who had spent years practicing tenderness in a country that had so often answered black tenderness with brutality. Some were elders whose lives stretched back through decades of insult, labor, prayer, and survival. Some were leaders in their families and schools and public life. Some had likely walked into that room so many Wednesdays before that the motions of the evening felt almost bodily, as familiar as breathing. A Bible opened, a voice reading, another voice answering. The scrape of a chair leg, the old wood of the sanctuary holding the sounds close. In the first part of the night the scene would have looked almost painfully ordinary, and that is what makes the next part feel so monstrous. Evil entered not to interrupt chaos, but to violate peace. Wikipedia to there are crimes that seem to happen in the outer edges of life, in places already marked by danger, where the violence feels like an eruption from an atmosphere already unstable. This was not that kind of crime. This was violence carried into prayer, a massacre imposed on Scripture, a hatred sharpened in private and brought into a room where people had gathered to study the Word of God. The hook of this story, the reason it still grips the American conscience years later, is not only that 9 people were murdered, it is that they were murdered in the middle of an act built on trust. They had not come to a concert, a bar, a street corner, or a battlefield. They had come to Bible study. They had come to sit under familiar lights and among familiar faces and talk about things larger than themselves. They had come believing that however bruising the world outside might be, the church still offered a small republic of safety. But safety in America has never been evenly distributed, and black sanctuary has always existed beneath threat, even when the doors are open and the hymns are full. Mother Emanuel itself carried that lesson in its bones. Long before 2015, the congregation had been shaped by white hostility to black independence, by the memory of Denmark Vesey and the burning of an earlier church, by the long truth that black gathering, black worship, and black self-determination have so often been treated as something to fear and punish. On that June night, the old history did not remain in the past. It stood up and walked back into the room with a gun in its hand. Emmanuel9.org 3 The man who entered the church carried white supremacist beliefs and a desire to spark racial terror. That much became tragically clear in the investigation and prosecution that followed. But in the beginning, before sirens and headlines and court records, the room knew only that a stranger had sat with them. The oldest trap of racial violence is that it often demands intimacy before it delivers destruction. It asks to be let near. It studies the room. It waits until the vulnerable are close enough to touch. There is something deeply predatory in that patience, in the willingness to listen to prayer, to hear the language of grace, to watch people lower their guard, and then to choose that moment to make slaughter out of fellowship. The hook, then, is not simply the attack itself. It is the slow approach of it. It is the way horror sat quietly through a lesson. It is the image of worshippers leaning over Scripture while death listened beside them. Even now, that image feels almost too symbolic, as if no country should have to see itself so clearly. But America did. In that one room, the nation's oldest sins met some of its oldest acts of faith, and faith was shot at close range. Wikipedia too. By the time the violence began, the sanctuary would have changed in an instant from a place of reflection into a place of noise so violent that memory itself must have struggled to hold it. Gunfire in an enclosed room is not only sound, it is concussion, it is pressure, it is wood and plaster and breath all jolted at once. It is the body understanding danger before the mind has shaped the word for it. Later, investigators would place the shooting within a narrow span of minutes, but minutes can contain entire lifetimes when people are trying to survive. In such moments, time stops behaving like time, it thickens, it tears, a second stretches into decision, and decision becomes instinct, and instinct becomes the thin wall between life and death. Somewhere in that room were people old enough to have seen many forms of American hatred in their lives, and perhaps none of those old wounds prepared them for the precision of this one. Somewhere in that room were people who had come with plans for the next morning, with family expecting them home, with errands to run, with grandchildren to call, with things unsaid that they assumed they still had time to say. Then all at once, time closed its fist. 9 black parishioners were killed that night during the Bible study. They would come to be known together as the Emmanuel Nine, but before they became a collective name in the language of mourning, each of them was a singular world, a pastor, a librarian, a sexton, a coach, a school administrator, a minister, a teacher, a son, a mother, a woman whose voice and habits and laughter were known in precise ways by the people who loved her. Mass murder always flattens the dead in its first public telling. The number arrives before the names, the headline arrives before the life. The hook of this story resists that flattening. The number 9 is not an abstract toll here. It is 9 interruptions so total that families would spend the rest of their lives learning the shape of their absence. Wikipedia too. Outside Charleston did not know yet what had happened inside one of its most storied sanctuaries. Streets still held the ordinary traffic of a southern night. Somewhere glasses clinked in restaurants. Somewhere televisions murmured in living rooms. Somewhere people folded laundry, checked messages, planned the next day, unaware that within the walls of Mother Emanuel a line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. That is another cruelty of such crimes. The world continues for a few minutes, as if nothing has happened. And in those minutes gulf opens between the people whose lives have already been broken and everyone else who is still living inside ordinary time. Then the first calls go out, then sirens begin to move, then blue lights rake across brick and pavement. Then officers, medics, investigators, reporters, mourners, and officials all begin to converge on a place that only moments earlier had been a Bible study. The city's night changes all at once. The church steps become a boundary between before and after. And still the building remains itself in outline, the same Gothic lines against the dark sky, the same historic face, which makes the violence inside feel even more blasphemous. Buildings are sometimes said to absorb what happens in them. If that is true, then Mother Emanuel absorbed not just bullets and screams that night, but the terrible collusion of centuries. The long black struggle to worship freely, and the long white effort to answer black freedom with force. National Park Service won. What made the murders instantly larger than Charleston was not only their scale, but their symbolism. America recognized the scene too quickly. A white supremacist, a historic black church, prayer interrupted by racist bloodshed. The details arranged themselves into a pattern older than the victims themselves, older than the building in its current form, older even than the Republic's favorite myths about its own innocence. The crime was at once immediate and ancestral. It belonged to 2015, with all the modern machinery of extremist ideology and media spectacle, but it also belonged to a much older landscape of burned churches, lynched bodies, segregated pews, and the routine humiliation of black life. That is why the murders became a national reckoning point. They did not feel isolated. They felt connected. They forced the country to look again at how racism survives not only in private opinion but in symbols, institutions, permissions, and fantasies of rightful domination. In the days that followed, the conversation would widen to Confederate iconography, domestic extremism, gun access, and the grammar of American denial. But the hook of the story begins before the arguments, before the speeches, before the legal language. It begins in the intimate betrayal of a Bible study circle. It begins with people making room for someone who had already chosen to destroy them. It begins with the silence before the first shot, that last thin veil over a room still living in trust. Department of Justice for, and yet the darkness of the crime is not the only force present in this opening. There is also the unbearable dignity of the place and the people in it. Mother Emanuel did not become holy because tragedy visited it. It was holy before the attack, because generations had built holiness there out of resistance, out of song, out of study, out of the insistence that black spiritual life could not be erased by white terror. The martyr entered thinking he could stamp his own ideology onto that sacred history, but the reason the story endures is that he did not define the church. He ruptured it, scarred it, and placed it forever in the record of American hate, but he did not author its meaning. That meaning had been written long before him by people who gathered, rebuilt, preached, organized, buried their dead, sang anyway, and kept the doors open. On the night of June 17, 2015, hatred tried to claim the sanctuary as its stage. Instead, it exposed itself before the whole country in the ugliest possible light. The nation saw not strength in the killer, but cowardice sharpened by ideology. It saw a man who could sit through prayer and answer welcome with bullets. It saw 9 black Christians targeted because of who they were, where they were, and what that church represented. And in the days after, even as grief spread and details emerged with sickening clarity, the image that remained burned into public memory was larger than the killer himself, a historic black church, wounded but standing, and a circle of worshippers whose final hour revealed both the brutality of racist extremism and the profound moral obscenity at its core. That is where this story begins. Not with the courtroom, not with the manifesto, not with the politics that followed, but with a summer evening in Charleston, a Bible open on a Wednesday night, and a sanctuary that had survived to centuries of American history only to face, yet again, the old hatred waiting at the door. Emmanuel9.org 3. To understand what happened at Mother Emanuel on the night of June 17, 2015, it is necessary to step back from the gunfire and the headlines and enter the deeper context that made the church more than a building and the attack more than a single night of violence. Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church stood in Charleston not merely as a place of weekly worship but as one of the oldest and most symbolically powerful black churches in the American South. A congregation whose history was braided into slavery, rebellion, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, civil rights struggle, and the long, unfinished argument over who gets to belong safely in the American story. The AIM denomination itself was born out of exclusion. Founded after black worshipers in Philadelphia withdrew from white-controlled Methodist space and built a religious tradition of their own under the leadership of Richard Allen. That origin mattered because, from the beginning, the church was about more than doctrine. It was about dignity, about the refusal to accept humiliation as the price of faith, about the insistence that black spiritual life did not need white supervision to be valid. Mother Emanuel carried that same inheritance into Charleston, a city whose beauty has always lived uneasily beside its brutality, where pastel facades and church spires can distract from the fact that the local economy and social order were built on slavery, racial hierarchy, and disciplined silence. The congregation's roots reached to 1816, and by 1822 one of its founders, Denmark Vesey, had become tied in white Charleston's mind to the fear of black uprising. After authorities claimed Vesey was part of a planned revolt, he and others were executed, and the church was burned down. Whether one tells that history from the perspective of terrorized white power or from the perspective of black yearning for liberation, the result is the same in one crucial sense. Emmanuel became marked, early and forever, as a place where black gathering itself was seen as dangerous by those who benefited from racial control. The church survived destruction, reformed, and endured through the 19th and 20th centuries until it came to be known as Mother Emanuel, a name that sounds tender until one remembers how much pain a black institution must survive before people begin calling it Mother. Wikipedia won Charleston in 2015 was a city capable of presenting itself as both modern and haunted. Tourists came for carriage rides, old houses, waterfront light polished restaurants, and the carefully staged atmosphere of Southern charm. But the city's deeper reality could never be separated from the Atlantic slave trade, from auction blocks, from plantation wealth, from the grammar of deference and domination that shaped everyday life for generations. In a place like Charleston, history is never absent. It lingers in street names, monuments, family legacies, preserved architecture, and the social instincts people inherit before they have language for them. The shooting at Mother Emanuel did not erupt into a blank space. It struck a city already layered with centuries of racial meaning. Even in 2015, the old Confederacy was not confined to textbooks or museum glass. Its symbols still circulated in public life, and one of the most visible reminders was the Confederate battle flag flying on the grounds of the South Carolina State House. The flag had defenders who spoke of heritage, ancestry, and regional pride, but to many black South Carolinians and many others across the country it stood plainly for white supremacy, racial terror, and the nostalgia of a defeated order that had fought to keep human beings enslaved. After the murders, debate over that flag intensified dramatically, but the important contextual truth is that the argument had not begun with the shooting. It was already there, unresolved, normalized, sitting in the civic landscape, as if the country had never fully decided whether the symbols of racial subjugation were shameful relics or acceptable decor. Wikipedia won the middle of the 2010s was also a period in which the United States was being forced again and again to confront the visible persistence of anti-black violence. The years before Charleston had seen nationwide outrage over the deaths of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, and others. Each case different in its details, but connected in public consciousness by a shared question: how much black vulnerability was still built into the operating system of American life? Black Lives Matter had emerged as a phrase, a movement, and a demand that the country stop treating anti-black death as isolated misfortune. This broader atmosphere matters because the murders at Mother Emanuel were not experienced only as a local atrocity. They landed in a nation already raw with argument over race, policing, memory, and denial. They felt almost immediately like part of a pattern, even though the scene was a church rather than a traffic stop or a neighborhood street. The target, the history of the site, and the killer's ideology all made the message unmistakable. The attack was not random. It was aimed at black people in black sacred space, and it arrived at a moment when the country was already struggling to admit how deeply racism still shaped its institutions and imagination. Federal authorities would later prosecute the case as a hate crime, and the Justice Department has repeatedly described the massacre as a horrific act of racial hatred. That legal framing did not invent the meaning of the crime, it recognized it. Department of Justice to inside Mother Emanuel, meanwhile, The context was something gentler and older than the national argument, a routine of fellowship that had been repeated enough times to feel almost immune to drama. Midweek Bible study is not a performance. It is not the grand pageantry of a holiday service or the packed energy of a Sunday crowd. It is smaller, more intimate, often more revealing. People come tired from work, from caregiving, from errands, from age itself. They bring prayer requests that may never make the formal record of a church's history. They speak more plainly. They listen more closely. The room is held together not by spectacle but by trust. In a church like Mother Emanuel, that trust carried generations with it. The people who entered on June 17th did so within a living institution that had taught its members, again and again, to meet history with faith, sorrow with endurance, and danger with solidarity. Reverend Clementa Pinckney embodied that blending of pastoral and public duty. As the church's pastor and a South Carolina state senator, he was not simply a man with two jobs. He represented a long Black tradition in which the church becomes both sanctuary and organizing center, spiritual shelter, and civic voice. Round him were parishioners whose lives gave texture to the church far beyond its public reputation. Cynthia Hurd, deeply tied to the public library system. Sharonda Singleton, a speech therapist and coach. Ethel Lance, who had served the church as a sexton. Myra Thompson, a Bible study leader. Tawanza Sanders, younger than many of the others. Carrying a different generation into that room, Susie Jackson, Daniel Simmons Sr., DePayne Middleton Dr. Each belonged not just to a congregation but to family networks, workplaces, neighborhoods, friendships, and routines that stretched far beyond the church walls. Context, in the fullest sense, means remembering that before they were victims in a national tragedy, they were people moving through a Wednesday like any other, with all the minor expectations and unfinished plans that ordinary life contains. Wikipedia 1. The killer's context was darker and far more familiar than many Americans wanted to admit. He was not the product of some incomprehensible alien evil detached from the culture around him. He was a young white man shaped by white supremacist ideology, by racist grievance, by fantasies of racial conflict, and by the poisonous mythology that Black advancement represents white dispossession. Investigators and prosecutors later presented evidence showing that he embraced neo-Nazi and white supremacist beliefs and wanted to ignite a race war. That ambition matters because it reveals the attack as performative in the most chilling sense. He was not only killing, he was trying to send a message, to stage an event that would terrify, divide, and inflame. Such thinking does not emerge from nowhere. It feeds on an ecosystem of symbols, slogans, revisionist history, online radicalization, and public equivocation about what racism looks like when it is no longer wearing the exact uniform of the 1950s. By 2015, the internet had already become a place where extremist ideas could circulate quickly, giving lonely and angry young men the illusion that their hatreds were not fringe at all but brave, forbidden truths. The old forms of white supremacy had learned new methods of distribution. They could be consumed in bedrooms, on message boards, through memes, through selective pseudo-history, through communities of resentment that rewarded fantasies of cleansing violence. When the murderer entered Mother Emanuel, he carried not just a weapon but an ideology assembled from both old American racism and newer digital pathways of radicalization. Wikipedia 1. What made Mother Emanuel such a potent target was precisely what made it beloved. It was visible, historic, Black, and sacred. It stood for survival. To a racist mind obsessed with dominance, that kind of place can appear intolerable. There is a particular fury in supremacist violence toward Black institutions that have endured because endurance itself rebukes the fantasy that Black life can be controlled, diminished, or erased. A church like Mother Emanuel says by its very existence that faith survived slavery, that community survived terror, that memory survived the people who tried to burn it out. To attack such a place is to try to wound not only bodies, but continuity. It is an assault on meaning. And yet there is another layer to the context that makes the coming violence even more unbearable. The Christian ethic of welcome. Churches open their doors. Bible studies make room for the unfamiliar face. Congregations are trained, morally and emotionally, to extend grace before suspicion. This is not naivete. It is part of the faith they practice. The murderer exploited that. He was able to enter, sit, and stay because the people around him behaved like church people. They did what decency taught them to do. That fact belongs to the context as much as any legal document or historical marker. The attack was made possible, in the most intimate sense, by the goodness of the people he chose to hate. Wikipedia 1 Beyond Charleston, the national media environment of 2015 was primed to convert trauma instantly into spectacle, argument, and symbolism. News moved fast, identities were established quickly, social media accelerated outrage and mourning, and public officials were pushed almost immediately into statements, condemnations, and policy positions. But before all that machinery took hold, there was the quieter human context of a city beginning to realize what had been lost. Charleston is a place where church life has social weight, where families overlap through schools, neighborhoods, civic groups, and generations of acquaintance. The dead would not be abstractions there. They would be remembered in voices, in handshakes, in choir robes, in mentoring relationships, in school hallways and library branches, in statehouse corridors, in kitchens, in family reunions, in small local habits outsiders would never know. A massacre in such a church is not merely an event. It is a tear through the fabric of recognition itself. The names spread through the city not like data but like shockwaves. One family called another. Phones lit up. Rumor became confirmation. The civic and the intimate merged. And because Mother Emanuel had such historical stature, local grief was instantly placed under national light. Charleston could not mourn privately. The whole country was watching before the night was done. Wikipedia 1 In the days after the murders, the context widened again, turning from history into consequence. The Confederate flag, long defended by many South Carolina leaders, came under renewed and finally decisive pressure. Public officials who had tolerated or protected its display now faced a moral landscape altered by blood. The fact that debate over Confederate symbolism accelerated so sharply after the shooting revealed something unsettling about the country. Symbols that had been painfully clear to Black Americans for generations suddenly became undeniable to many white Americans only after 9 people were slaughtered in church. The South Carolina legislature moved within weeks to remove the Confederate battle flag from the State House grounds, and the flag came down on July 10, 2015. That sequence matters to the context because it shows the murders acting not only as a tragedy, but as a catalyst, forcing long-postponed reckonings into the open. Yet even that outcome carried its own bitter truth. Change arrived because violence stripped away the nation's favorite excuses. The dead paid, in part, for clarity that should never have required their deaths. Wikipedia 1 So when the Bible study began on June 17, 2015, all of this was already present, whether anyone in the room named it or not. The legacy of Richard Allen and Black religious independence, the memory of Denmark Vesey and the burned church, the centuries-long unease of white power confronted by Black gathering. The polished surface of Charleston laid over its brutal foundations, the unresolved public life of Confederate symbolism, the modern resurgence and circulation of white supremacist ideology, the national atmosphere of racial tension and protest, and the intimate culture of trust inside a congregation that had learned to survive by staying open-hearted. That is the context of Mother Emanuel. It was not merely the backdrop to the crime. It was part of why the crime struck so deeply and still echoes so loudly. The church was not chosen by accident. The victims were not interchangeable. The night did not fall onto a neutral map. Everything about the setting gave the attack historical voltage. To enter Part 3, the story of the victim's experience, we have to hold all of that in view. The sanctuary as refuge, the city as layered stage. The nation is audience already aching with unresolved racial truth, and a room full of believers stepping into Bible study without knowing that history, once again, was walking toward them armed. Wikipedia 1. What happened inside Mother Emanuel is hardest to approach at the level of the human voice, because by the time the public learned the names, the event had already been flattened into category words that feel too blunt for the room in which it took place: shooting, massacre, hate crime, terrorism, murder. Those words are accurate, but they arrive from outside. Part 3 asks for something more intimate. It asks us to stand, as carefully as we can, on the threshold of the victim's own evening and to see the night not first as history, but as lived experience. On June 17, 2015, 12 Black parishioners and church leaders gathered in Mother Emanuel's Fellowship Hall for the weekly Bible study, a smaller and more intimate setting than a large Sunday service. The kind of room where people do not perform belief so much as inhabit it. Among them were Reverend Clementa Pinckney, the church's pastor, and a South Carolina state senator, Myra Thompson, who helped lead the study, Ethel Lance, Susie Jackson, Reverend Daniel Simmons Sr., Reverend DePayne Middleton, Dr. Reverend Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Cynthia Hurd, Tiwanza Sanders, and survivors including Felicia Sanders, her granddaughter, Polly Shepard, and Jennifer Pinckney with her daughter. The official record makes clear that the gathering was a Bible study in the fellowship hall and that 5 people survived from inside the church that night. Department of Justice 1. But a record cannot show the texture of a Wednesday evening in church. It cannot show the small courtesies that make such a room feel sheltered from the world outside. It cannot show the familiar exchange of glances when someone arrives a little late, the way older hands rest on an open Bible, the slight lean of a body listening closely, the tiredness people bring in with them after a workday, or the comfort of sitting among others who already know your face. In a Bible study, people are not braced for performance or public danger. They are softened by routine. They are prepared to listen, to reflect, to answer a question about Scripture, to share something from their week. In that sense, the victim's statement begins long before anyone speaks. It begins in the fact that they came there expecting gentleness. The room held a cross-section of Black life shaped by service, endurance, responsibility, and care. Clementa Pinckney was only 41, but he had already become one of those figures around whom multiple worlds revolve. He was a pastor, a legislator, a husband, a father, a man whose duties followed him from pulpit to statehouse and back again. Myra Thompson was known for her ministry and her seriousness about Scripture. Cynthia Hurd had spent decades in public service through the Charleston County Public Library. Sharonda Coleman Singleton worked as a speech therapist and was also a pastor and coach. Ethel Lance had cared for the church as a sexton. DePayne Middleton Doctor was a minister and a mother. Daniel Simmons Sr. was an elder with years behind him, and people who loved him in the specific, protective way families love an older man whose presence feels foundational. Susie Jackson carried the gravity of age as well. Tiwanza Sanders, at 26, was the youngest person killed, a son and graduate with the kind of forward life that still seems to be opening instead of narrowing. Each of them entered that room with a whole biography already built behind the face the others saw that evening. The tragedy of mass violence is that the public meets the dead in reverse order, through the fact of their death before the fact of their life. The victim's own statement, if we are to honor it, begins by refusing that reversal. They were not characters placed into a historical tableau. They were people midway through ordinary life. National Park Service too. At some point during the evening, a stranger entered. The known sequence is that the gunman arrived at approximately 8:16 p.m. and joined the Bible study group. That detail alone says something profound about the people in the room. They did not shut the door of faith against him. They did what church people often do when someone unfamiliar appears. They made room. They let him sit among them. Polly Shepard later became one of the 2 key survivor witnesses whose testimony helped establish what happened inside. Felicia Sanders also testified, and the Justice Department's appellate briefing makes clear that eyewitness testimony from those survivors formed an important part of the government's case. Department of Justice 1. We do not need to invent dramatic dialogue to understand what that hour must have felt like from the victim's side. They were doing what Bible study requires, including listening, allowing another person into a circle that is held together by trust. There is something almost unbearable in that image. Hospitality is not an accessory to church life. In rooms like that, it is part of the faith itself. A stranger is not first an intruder. He is first a guest. So for nearly an hour, hatred sat inside welcome. The victim's statement, if it could be heard in its full moral force, would begin there. We received him. We did not know. We behaved as believers are taught to behave. We treated a young white stranger not as a threat but as a human being with a chair waiting for him. That fact does not reduce the violence that followed. It deepens it. It reveals the crime not simply as murder but as a predation on decency. The Bible study itself appears to have focused on Scripture in the book of Mark. One can imagine the atmosphere without pretending to know every word that was spoken. There would have been pauses for reading, responses from those gathered, the rhythm of a room used to reflection rather than argument. Some participants might have spoken more than others. Some might have listened in the quiet, inward way that older church members sometimes do, hearing every word but feeling no need to display it. The air in Charleston in June would still have held the weight of heat even after sunset. Clothing would have carried the day's warmth. A room like that, with people gathered around Scripture in the evening, can feel both ordinary and deeply apart from the world. The outside city recedes, the pace changes. People settle into a moral weather different from the one outside. That is why the coming violence was not only physical, it was sacrilegious in the human sense. It did not merely end lives. It violated the conditions under which those lives were gathered. It took the safety of study, prayer, and fellowship and turned it into the stage for racial slaughter. From the victim's side, the betrayal is central. The danger did not come at them from far away. It sat beside them long enough to be absorbed into the room. Department of Justice 1. Then came the moment when the disguise dropped. Public evidence established that the gunman opened fire on the Bible study participants and killed 9 black parishioners. The 5 survivors were forever altered by what they witnessed and endured. Department of Justice 3. Here the victim's statement reaches the limit of what narration can honestly know. Because the interior reality of being in that room when the shooting started belongs finally to those who were there, and to some of them only for seconds before death. Still, certain truths can be approached. In any enclosed room, the first shots would have shattered not only bodies, but comprehension. Gunfire indoors is confusing, explosive, disorienting. People do not immediately process a massacre in terms that journalists later use with clinical speed. They understand first that something impossible has begun. Chairs scrape, bodies recoil, hands lift instinctively. Some freeze, some run, some turn toward loved ones. Some older people may not move quickly enough even to complete the thought of escape. A young man like Tawanza Sanders, facing a threat in a room that held elders and family friends, may not have experienced the moment as personal survival alone, but as a split-second collision of terror and protective instinct. We know from reporting and courtroom evidence outside these search results that he attempted to intervene, and while I am not relying on that here for detail, the very shape of his biography and his age makes his death feel especially full of unfinished movement. The victim's statement inside such a room would not be a composed narrative. It would be fragments, a scream, a prayer, a plea, the name of a family member, the shock of falling, the old instinct to protect the child near you, the older instinct to cover someone smaller or weaker, the body's desperate attempt to find meaning in the impossible. Mass murder often erases the final humanity of its victims by reducing them to casualties. Yet in any room under attack, people continue being who they are for as long as consciousness lasts. The caring keep caring, the devout keep praying, the protective keep reaching, the elders keep trying to steady others even while fear is ripping through them. The faithful do not stop being faithful because terror enters the room. Terror simply puts terrible pressure on what faith already is. That is part of what makes this crime so morally revolting. It targeted people in the middle of practicing exactly the virtues the killer despised in them: fellowship, dignity, Black sacred community, patience, and welcome. Some died where they sat. Some likely had time only to register the betrayal. Some may have understood in an instant that this was racial hatred brought into the church. The official record and later prosecution made that motive unmistakable. Department of Justice 3. The survivor's presence is crucial to this section because the victim's statement includes not only those who died but also those who carried the room's last living memory outward. The Emanuel 9 Memorial Foundation identifies the survivors as Felicia Sanders and her granddaughter, Jennifer Pinckey, and her daughter, and Polly Shepard, and notes that their resilience and public grace shaped the world's response to the tragedy. Emmanuel9.org for that public grace is often remembered first because it astonished the country, but before forgiveness came survival. Before national symbolism came hiding fear, blood, breath held in the body, the terrible wait to know whether the gunman would return his attention to you. Imagine the room after the first wave of gunfire, the stunned silence between shots, or perhaps the ringing in the ears that follows them, the smell of smoke and blood. The bodies suddenly transformed from beloved people into terrible evidence of what has happened, the unnatural stillness of some, and the desperate stillness of others who are trying not to be noticed. The victim's statement lives there too, in the gap between the dead and the not yet dead, when survival can depend on absolute silence and an almost superhuman control over panic. A child near an adult covering a child, an older survivor trapped within sight of the dying. These are not dramatic embellishments. They are the ordinary shape of human beings trying to remain alive inside racist massacre. If one were to strip away all ideology and public controversy and simply ask what the victims experienced, the answer would be this: they experienced the collapse of trust into terror at arm's length. They experienced the violation of sanctuary. They experienced being targeted while black in a place that had spent centuries proving that black worship and black endurance could survive anything. And still, even here, their statement is not only one of horror, it is also one of identity. They were in church, they were in Bible study, they were together. They were not isolated individuals scattered by chance. They were a community under attack. That communal fact matters because it means the killer did not enter a room of strangers. He entered a woven fabric of relations. Every shot struck not only a body but a set of bonds. Every death was immediately multiple in its meaning because every victim was attached to others in the room, in the church, in the city, in the family. The grief began before the bodies were carried out. It began in the room itself, in whoever was still conscious enough to know who had fallen. From the outside, the nation would later see photographs, biographies, courtroom footage, memorial names. But the deepest victim's statement remains the one no camera captured: a Wednesday Bible study that opened itself in trust, a gathering of black parishioners who did nothing but welcome and worship, and a final hour in which their humanity remained morally larger than the hatred that came to destroy them. That is the heart of this section. They were not defined by the violence imposed on them. They were defined first by the life they had built in that room before it began, and by the fact that even as death entered among them, the setting of their final moments was not fear but fellowship, not rage but scripture, Not cruelty, but the quiet, ordinary grace of a church evening in Charleston. Department of Justice 1. The incident itself unfolded with the cruel efficiency of something planned in private and executed inside a room built for trust. On Wednesday, June 17, 2015, as evening settled over Charleston and the heat of the day still clung to the city's brick and pavement, a Bible study gathered in the fellowship hall of Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, the historic black congregation known as Mother Emanuel. Inside that room were parishioners who had come for what should have been an ordinary midweek act of faith, reading scripture, listening to one another, and closing the night in prayer. Around 8:16 p.m., the man who would murder 9 of them parked his car, entered the fellowship hall, and took his place among the group. He was carrying a Glock .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun and 8 loaded magazines, all concealed in a tactical pouch. The evidence later presented by the Justice Department showed that he had driven from Columbia to Charleston with the intention of killing African Americans and had selected Mother Emanuel because of its historic importance and because he knew Bible study would be taking place there that evening. The attack was not impulsive, not chaotic, and not born in the instant. It had been considered, prepared, and brought deliberately into that room. Department of Justice 1. When he entered, the room responded with the ordinary kindness of church people. The 12 parishioners gathered there welcomed him. Reverend Sharonda Coleman Singleton announced that there was a visitor. Reverend Clementa Pinckney seated him next to himself and handed him a Bible and a study sheet. Another parishioner told a light story that made the young man chuckle. Nothing in those gestures was extraordinary in a church setting, and that is precisely what makes the next stage of the incident feel so devastating. The group did not treat him like an enemy because he had not yet revealed himself as one. They treated him as a newcomer to Bible study, which is what he appeared to be. For roughly 45 minutes he sat among them while scripture was read and discussed. He listened. He remained in the circle. He accepted, at least outwardly, the hospitality offered to him. The room around him would have felt intimate rather than ceremonial, smaller and more personal than a Sunday service, the kind of room where shoes scrape softly against the floor, pages turn in unison, and people who know one another settle naturally into the rhythm of shared faith. That is part of the incident too, because what happened was not simply that gunfire erupted in a building. It is that the violence was threaded into a space of prayer slowly enough for everyone present to absorb him as part of the evening before he turned that acceptance into an opportunity for massacre. Department of Justice 1. The transition from Bible study to slaughter came at the closing prayer. According to the Justice Department's appellate summary of the evidence, after about 45 minutes the parishioners rose and shut their eyes for prayer. It was then that he pulled out the gun and shot Reverend Pinckney several times before repeatedly firing at the remaining parishioners as they dove under tables. In practical terms, that means the incident began at the most defenseless moment of the gathering, when eyes were closed, bodies were upright or shifting in prayer, and attention was turned away from suspicion and toward God. The betrayal is almost impossible to overstate. In that instant, the calm internal weather of the room was obliterated. The first shots would not have sounded like isolated cracks in a room that size. Felicia Sanders later described the noise as like a machine gun going off in the room. Sound in an enclosed hall does not merely travel, it slams, it ricochets, it turns the air itself violent. People who moments earlier had been standing for prayer were suddenly scrambling under tables, collapsing, or trying to understand whether what they were hearing could possibly be real. The incident did not unfold like a duel or a confrontation in which danger was gradually recognized. It arrived as ambush at close range. Department of Justice 1. Reverend Pinckney was hit first. Then Reverend Daniel Simmons Sr., already in his 70s, and known inside the church as a central presence, stood and said that he needed to check on his pastor. The record states, That the gunman then shot Simmons at least 6 times, this detail carries a terrible emotional clarity. Even inside panic, Simmons's instinct was pastoral and relational. He rose not in aggression but in concern. The room had become chaos, but he was still oriented toward another human being. That is often the hidden truth inside acts of mass violence. The victims do not cease being themselves just because terror enters the room. The caring still try to care. The brave still try to move toward others. The devout still speak and act in the language of responsibility, even when responsibility has become almost impossibly dangerous. The gunman, meanwhile, moved through the room pacing, firing at parishioners hiding under tables, and repeatedly reloading his weapon. This was not a brief burst of indiscriminate shooting followed by flight. It was sustained, methodical violence inside a confined space where the victims had limited means of escape. The evidence showed he fired 74 bullets in all. Each number in that total suggests something about the incident's texture. Pauses to reload, movement across the room, repeated decisions to continue, repeated chances to stop that were not taken. Department of Justice 1. As the shooting continued, the room split into tiny islands of survival, each defined by instinct, terror, and whatever cover could be found. Felicia Sanders grabbed her granddaughter and tried to keep her silent, telling the child to play dead while holding her so tightly against her own body that she feared she was suffocating her. Nearby, Polly Shepard watched from under table as the gunman's boots approached. She had been praying aloud. He spoke to her, then decided not to shoot her, saying he would leave her alive to tell the story. That decision is part of the incident because it reveals the performance built into the crime. He was not acting only from rage in the moment. He wanted witness, aftermath, narrative. He wanted the terror carried outward. A massacre in a sacred place does not end with the final shot if the killer imagines it as a message to the world. The survivors were meant to become unwilling vessels of that message. Yet what he could not control was the moral meaning those survivors would eventually give to the public memory of that night. In the room itself, though, his choice to spare Shepard added another layer of dread. Survival was no longer a matter only of hiding or luck. It had become dependent on the shifting whims of a man pacing through prayer tables with a reloading handgun. Department of Justice 1. One of the most piercing moments in the record came when Tawanza Sanders, who had been communicating with his mother from under table and knew she and his young relative were still alive, stood up and tried to redirect the gunman's attention. He asked why this was happening. The killer responded with racist lies about black people taking over the nation and harming white women. Tawanza told him they meant him no harm. The gunman then shot him multiple times. This exchange captures the ideological heart of the incident with frightening clarity. Inside a church fellowship hall, amid fallen bodies and people crouched under tables, the killer voiced the paranoid racial mythology that had brought him there. It was not merely hatred in the abstract, it was a worldview built on grievance, fantasy, and the belief that black existence itself justified exterminatory violence. Tawanza's response was the human opposite of that ideology. It was an attempt to speak to him as a person, to recall him to the fact that the people in that room were not enemies, invaders, or symbols in some racial fever dream. They were human beings gathered for Bible study. The fact that this appeal failed is not surprising in a factual sense, but it remains morally shocking. The incident stripped the gunman's beliefs of all disguise. He had entered the room quiet enough to be welcomed, and now stood over worshippers articulating white supremacist fiction as he killed them. Department of Justice 1. During a pause in the shooting, Polly Shepard called 911. Jennifer Pinky, who had been hiding with her daughter in the pastor's study adjacent to the fellowship hall, also called 911. According to the Justice Department record, the gunman exited the church at 9:06 p.m. This means that from his entry at approximately 8:16 p.m. to his departure just after 9 p.m., The whole incident inside Mother Emanuel moved from welcomed visitor to mass murder in less than an hour. The actual shooting phase was shorter still, but within those compressed minutes an enormous amount of human life was destroyed. As he left, Tawanza Sanders, still alive for a brief time, began trying to make his way across the floor toward his Aunt Susie Jackson while calling for her. Felicia Sanders, hearing sirens by then, tried to get her son to lie still and wait for help. He died shortly after first responders arrived. Reverend Simmons was also still alive when help reached him, suffering traumatic gunshot injuries. He later died at the hospital. The other 7 victims showed no signs of life when responders entered. The final toll from the Bible study group was 9 dead, with 3 direct survivors from the class itself, and Jennifer Pinky and her daughter surviving in the pastor's study. The public often encounters these facts as a finished tally, but inside the incident they would have unfolded as a sequence of agonizing recognitions. Someone is down, someone is not moving. Someone is whispering, someone is bleeding, someone is trying to crawl, someone is still calling a name. The room after the shooter's exit would not have become calm simply because the gunfire stopped. Silence after violence is often its own kind of terror, a silence broken by breathing, prayer, moaning, the voices of those still alive trying to locate the others, and the growing nearness of sirens from outside. Department of Justice 1 outside the church, the incident was already becoming a citywide emergency. The Charleston Police Department began receiving calls around 9:05 p.m., and law enforcement quickly moved to identify a fleeing suspect. Surveillance footage from the church helped police release images, and a massive manhunt began almost immediately. But from the internal perspective of the incident, those developments belong to a later layer of the story. In the immediate sense, what matters is that a Bible study had been transformed into a crime scene with extraordinary speed. People who had entered carrying only the ordinary burdens of a Wednesday evening were now lying on the floor of a historic sanctuary annex, their lives ended or changed forever. The shooter fled not with some brilliant escape strategy but, according to the Justice Department, without expecting to survive and without a real plan, eventually driving toward North Carolina. The following morning, officers in Shelby, North Carolina stopped his vehicle after a tip, and he identified himself and admitted involvement in the Charleston shooting. At the FBI interview that followed, he confessed to killing African Americans at Mother Emanuel, stated that his mission was to kill black people, and said he wanted to agitate race relations and cause a race war. These admissions confirm what the incident inside the fellowship hall had already shown in blood. This was a racist massacre carried out in a historic black church by a man who had chosen the setting for symbolic as well as practical reasons. He told investigators he selected Mother Emanuel because it was historically important, because Charleston was a historic city, and because he could find African Americans there at Bible study. Department of Justice 1. But the incident should not be remembered only through the killer's planning or confession. Its deepest shape lies in the collision between the room's purpose and the violence brought into it. Mother Emanuel was not hosting a rally, a political confrontation, or an event centered on fear. It was holding Bible study. The people inside were engaged in one of the quietest, least guarded forms of collective religious life. They had opened Scripture. They had welcomed a stranger. They had risen for closing prayer. The gunman exploited each of those facts. He used the church's openness as access, the intimacy of the study as concealment, the posture of prayer as vulnerability, and the historic meaning of Mother Emanuel as the stage for a message of racial terror. That is what makes the incident more than a sequence of ballistic facts. It was also a symbolic assault on sanctuary itself. It told black worshipers across the country that even prayer in one of the most historic black churches in the South could be penetrated by racist violence. It told America that the old hatred had not vanished into fringe fantasy but could still walk through a church door. sit through a Bible lesson, and open fire at the closing prayer. By the time the gunman stepped back into the Charleston night, 9 people had been mortally wounded or killed in that room. The survivors were carrying memories that would never leave them. And Mother Emanuel had been marked forever by an event that felt both horribly modern and terrifyingly ancient in its racial meaning. The incident lasted less than an hour from entry to exit, and only minutes in its deadliest phase, yet it gathered within those minutes centuries of American history. The vulnerability of black sanctuary, the persistence of white supremacist ideology, the exploitation of Christian welcome, and the unbearable dignity of people whose final act before terror descended was simply to pray together. Department of Justice 1. When the shooting stopped inside Mother Emanuel, the fellowship hall did not become still in any peaceful sense. It became still in the way places do after violence has moved through them and left everything behind it altered. The crime scene that first responders entered just after 9 p.m. on June 17, 2015, was not only the site of a mass killing, it was a room in which ordinary objects had been forced to absorb terror. Bible study papers, chairs, tables, open Bibles, personal belongings, and the bodies of people who had come to church on a Wednesday evening now formed the first silent record investigators would have to read. According to the Federal Appellate Record, the gunman had entered around 8:16 p.m., sat through the Bible study for roughly 45 minutes, then opened fire during the closing prayer, ultimately discharging 74 rounds before leaving the church at 9:06 p.m. By the time emergency personnel reached the fellowship hall, 9 black parishioners had been mortally wounded or killed, and 5 people had survived. 8 of the victims died at the scene, while Reverend Daniel Simmons Sr. was transported to the hospital and later died of his injuries. The raw physical facts were already enough to establish that investigators were dealing not with a spontaneous quarrel or a targeted attack on one individual, but with a sustained massacre carried out at close range in a confined room. The first clues did not have to be hidden. They were everywhere. The number of spent casings, the concentration of blood, the positions of the dead, the signs of repeated reloading, the survivors' locations under tables and in adjoining spaces, and the absence of any meaningful struggle by the victims all pointed toward an ambush executed against people caught in worship and prayer. Department of Justice 1. The fellowship hall itself offered the earliest map of what had happened. The room was not a chaotic public space with multiple unknown actors crossing in every direction. It was a contained environment, which matters because contained environments preserve patterns. In a room like that, the placement of bodies relative to tables and chairs can reveal whether people were seated, standing, kneeling, or scrambling for cover when the shots began. The federal record states that when the gunman opened fire, parishioners dove under tables. That detail carries weight because it shows the victims did not anticipate danger until the instant it arrived, and that once it did, the room transformed from Bible study into a desperate refuge of improvised hiding places. Tables that minutes earlier held scripture materials and resting arms became shields so thin they were almost symbolic. Investigators would have seen immediately that many of the victims had not been struck in motion toward an exit but in the compressed spaces where they had tried to protect themselves. That pattern says something about the nature of the assault. It was not a firefight. There was no exchange, no broad dispersal, no defensive capability on the victim's part. It was one armed man moving through a room against people trying to shrink themselves beneath furniture, cover loved ones, or remain unseen. This is part of what made the crime scene so eloquent in its first forensic language. The room showed domination, not confrontation. It showed pursuit within confinement. Department of Justice 1. Ballistics formed one of the earliest and most decisive categories of evidence. The killer used a Glock .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun and brought 8 loaded magazines into the church in a tactical pouch. He fired 74 bullets during the attack. Such numbers are not mere statistics when considered in relation to a room of Bible study participants. They indicate repeated conscious action. To fire that many rounds indoors required pauses, reorientation, and multiple decisions to continue. The appellate record also notes that 54 projectiles were recovered from the 9 victims' bodies, and that all 9 were killed by multiple gunshots fired at close range. That recovery mattered for several reasons. It reinforced the prosecution's later ability to show intent to kill beyond any imaginable doubt. It demonstrated the ferocity of the attack, which was not a matter of stray rounds or a single sweep of panic. And it helped reconstruct the killer's movement through the room, because ballistic pathways, impact points, and recovered projectiles can tell investigators where he stood, how often he changed position, and whether victims were hit while upright, crouching, or already down. Multiple close-range gunshot wounds across all 9 dead also revealed that once the shooting started, the gunman did not merely open fire blindly and flee. He remained engaged with the room, continuing to shoot at parishioners as they hid under tables. The physical evidence and the survivors' testimony fit one another with terrible precision. Department of Justice 1. The victims' positions and injuries were themselves a form of testimony. Reverend Clementa Pinckney was the first person shot after the closing prayer began. Reverend Daniel Simmons Sr. then rose, saying he needed to see about his pastor, and was shot at least 6 times. Tawanza Sanders later stood and tried to speak to the gunman, asking why this was happening, and was then shot multiple times. These details come from eyewitness accounts preserved in the federal record, but the seeing would also have reflected them materially, the location of Pinckney near where the group had gathered. Simmons's position consistent with someone who rose and moved, Sanders's location relative to where he had attempted to intervene or redirect attention. Investigators often begin by reading a room before they ever hear a witness. In this case, what they found would have corroborated a massacre unfolding in phases, a first victim struck at the head of the group, others falling or diving for cover, the shooter continuing to move and fire among people seeking concealment, and at least some victims struck while attempting either to help others or to communicate with the killer. Even the fact that Simmons survived long enough to be transported told first responders something immediate. The incident was still unfolding in medical time, with the difference between life and death not yet fully resolved when police and medics crossed into the room. Department of Justice 1. One of the most haunting aspects of the crime scene was the contrast between the room's purpose and the damage done within it. This was not a gang corner, a drug house, or any other location the public imagination too easily marks as violent beforehand. It was a church fellowship hall during Bible study. Investigators would have encountered scripture materials, study sheets, and signs of ordinary church use side by side with blood spatter, spent shell casings, bullet damage, and overturned or partially displaced furniture. Crime scenes always tell 2 stories at once: what the place was meant to be and what violence made of it. At Mother Emanuel, that contrast was devastatingly sharp. The room still bore the shape of religious fellowship even after slaughter. That contrast also became an early clue to motive. A sacred black space targeted during prayer carries implications that extend beyond the mechanics of homicide. Even before the shooter was apprehended and confessed, the site itself suggested symbolic selection. This was not simply where he found people, it was where he chose to find them. Department of Justice 1 survivor locations helped investigators understand both the course of the shooting and the means by which some people escaped death. Felicia Sanders survived by pulling her granddaughter down and telling her to play dead. Polly Shepard survived under a table after the gunman spared her. Jennifer Pinckney and her daughter survived because they were in the pastor's study with the door locked. These survivor positions matter in forensic terms because they define lines of sight, probable shooter movement, and the extent to which certain areas of the room were directly exposed. They also support the finding that the killer controlled the environment rather than being surprised or interrupted inside it. If one survivor lived because he chose not to shoot her, and others lived because they were concealed or separated behind a locked door, then the scene points not to indiscriminate spray fire in the abstract but to directed violence in which the shooter could see, select, and continue. Polly Shepard's survival in particular became one of the earliest interpretive clues because the gunman reportedly told her he was leaving her alive to tell the story. That statement, later part of witness testimony, framed the crime as communicative as well as lethal. The massacre was meant to echo beyond the room. The scene, therefore, was never only local evidence. It was also the first stage of a hate-fueled performance the killer hoped would radiate upward into public fear. Department of Justice 1. The physical absence of meaningful resistance from the victims was itself an initial clue with moral force. Investigators were not confronted with signs of struggle that might suggest an altercation, provocation, or mutual escalation. Instead, the evidence and witness accounts indicated that the parishioners were ambushed during prayer and while trying to hide. That fact cut away possible false narratives almost immediately. The scene belonged to a room of worshippers attacked at a moment of maximum vulnerability for law enforcement and prosecutors. That mattered because it supported not only murder charges, but the later framing of the attack as a hate crime and a deliberate assault on the free exercise of religion. The setting, timing, and victim behavior were not incidental. They were part of the offense. The killer had exploited Christian hospitality to enter the room, used the structure of Bible study to remain close to his targets, and waited until close in prayer to begin shooting. The scene showed all of that in reverse. What investigators saw first was the aftermath. But from the aftermath one could reconstruct the premeditated exploitation that made it possible. Department of Justice 1. Outside the fellowship hall, the church itself yielded another category of initial clues: surveillance footage and access routes. Authorities quickly obtained images showing the gunman entering and later leaving the church. These images were crucial almost at once. They gave police a visible suspect, his clothing, his haircut, and the rough timing of his movements. In many homicide investigations, the first hours are swallowed by uncertainty about who even committed the act. Here, the church's own surveillance system helped collapse that uncertainty. Investigators did not yet have the killer in custody, but they had his image and a narrowed timeline. That meant the crime scene was not a sealed mystery waiting for identity to emerge over weeks or months. It was a violent scene already linked to a visible perpetrator, which accelerated the manhunt dramatically. The surveillance images, combined with survivor accounts, meant that law enforcement could move quickly from scene preservation to suspect dissemination. When the images were released, the public could assist, and that public assistance would become decisive the next morning when a tip led police in Shelby, North Carolina, to stop his vehicle. Wikipedia to the killer's departure from the room at 9:06 p.m. and the Charleston Police Department's receipt of calls at about 9:05 p.m. also shaped investigators' first understanding of duration. This was not a 10-second burst lost in confusion. It was a brief but extended event long enough for 911 calls to be made from within the church while the shooter was still present or only just leaving. Duration matters in crime scene analysis because it affects witness memory, shooter behavior, reload opportunities, and the likelihood of spoken statements during the attack. In this case, the sustained nature of the shooting allowed multiple witness observations that later aligned with the physical evidence: the repeated reloading, the pacing, the racist statements, the sparing of one witness, and the final exit by side door. The room, in other words, was not simply struck by violence. It was occupied by it for minutes that felt much longer to those inside. The scene investigators inherited was the residue of that occupation. Department of Justice won another early clue lay not inside the room but in the identities of the victims themselves. All 9 of those killed were black members of the In Church. In a historic black church during Bible study, with a white male suspect who had entered alone and then fled, the racial pattern was immediate and impossible to ignore. Even before federal prosecutors assembled the full evidentiary case about the shooter's ideology, the victim selection already pointed strongly toward racial motive. Crime scenes can disclose motive indirectly through pattern, and here the pattern was stark. No robbery, no known personal dispute involving one target, no attempt to conceal the act, and no mixed victim profile that might imply some other primary purpose. Instead, there was a white gunman attacking black worshippers in one of the most historically significant black churches in the South. The scene itself suggested hatred shaped by symbolism. Later evidence, including the shooter's confession and online writings, made that explicit, but the basic interpretive line was visible from the first night. Department of Justice 1. The first responders' experience of the scene should also be understood as part of the early clue structure. When police and medics entered, they were not merely preserving evidence, they were stepping into a room where human beings had moments earlier been praying and were now dead or dying. That reality can affect everything from movement decisions to the urgency of triage versus preservation. Reverend Simmons and Tawanza Sanders were still alive when help arrived, though both would die soon after. That means the earliest official interaction with the scene involved both crime scene recognition and emergency medical response. Investigators had to begin building the factual record even as medics attempted to save the last remaining lives. The room therefore existed, for a short period, in 2 states at once, as an active medical emergency and as a fixed site of homicide evidence. That overlap often leaves marks on how a scene is first processed, but it also sharpens the emotional truth of what police encountered. This was not history yet, it was fresh suffering. Department of Justice 1. By the morning after the shooting, some of the earliest clues from the room had already connected with clues from beyond it. The suspect had been identified, his image circulated, his car noticed by a member of the public, and he was taken into custody in North Carolina. According to the federal record, he then confessed to killing African Americans at Mother Emanuel, said his mission was to kill black people, and explained that he wanted to agitate race relations and start a race war. He also said he selected Mother Emanuel because of its historical importance, because Charleston was historic, and because he knew he would find black people there at Bible study. These admissions did not replace the significance of the crime scene. They illuminated it. The room's clues had already pointed toward racial terror in sacred space. The confession confirmed that interpretation with chilling directness. The scattered shell casings, the close-range wounds, the survivors under tables, the locked study door, the surveillance images, the dead gathered where they had met for scripture. All of it now fit within the logic the killer himself described. The fellowship hall had been chosen as both a practical site of vulnerability and a symbolic stage. Department of Justice 1. In the end, the crime scene at Mother Emanuel spoke with terrible clarity from the first night onward. It said that this was a massacre carried out in prayer. It said that the victims had been caught in welcome, not conflict. It said that the shooter had prepared for sustained killing by bringing extra magazines and firing 74 rounds. It said that many victims died where they tried to hide or where they rose in concern for others. It said that the church's history mattered because this particular room was not accidentally filled with these particular people on this particular night. And it said, perhaps most painfully, that sacred spaces are never only symbolic after violence enters them. They become physical records of the collision between what human beings build for one another and what hatred tries to destroy. The first clues inside Mother Emanuel did not merely help solve a case. They revealed, almost immediately, the shape of the evil that had walked into that room, and the dignity of the people it had chosen to attack. Department of Justice 1. In the first hours after the massacre at Mother Emanuel, the investigation moved with a rare and terrible clarity, not because the crime was simple, but because the killer had committed it in a way that left behind both a room full of evidence and living witnesses who could describe the man who had sat among them before he opened fire. Charleston police received calls around 9:05 p.m. on June 17, 2015, and investigators rapidly understood that this was not a shooting with multiple unknown assailants, a confused street crime, or a dispute that had spiraled out of control. It was an attack inside a church fellowship hall during Bible study, carried out by a young white man who had fled the scene after killing 9 black parishioners. Surveillance footage from the church and survivor descriptions allowed authorities to circulate the suspect's image quickly, and that immediate identification shaped everything that followed. In many murder investigations, detectives lose crucial time trying to determine who was even present, who had motive, or whether the killer knew the victims personally. Here, the first major question was not who the suspect might be in a broad speculative sense, but where the man in the images had gone, and whether he intended to strike again. That urgency changed the emotional and operational tempo of the investigation. It was not a slow walk through possibilities. It was a race against a still-living ideology in motion. The first suspect emerged almost immediately from the evidence. The survivors' accounts, the surveillance images, and the timeline all pointed toward the same person. And by the morning of June 18th, a tip from the public helped law enforcement locate and arrest Dylan Roof in Shelby, North Carolina. The speed of that arrest can create the illusion that the investigation had no uncertainty, but that would be misleading. What the police solved quickly was the identity and location of the gunman. What remained far more difficult was understanding the full architecture of the crime. Whether he had help, whether anyone had known what he intended, how long he had been planning it, why he chose Mother Emanuel in particular, and what larger ideological network had shaped him. Those are the deeper questions that turn a manhunt into an investigation. They are also the questions that often lead detectives into dead ends, false assumptions, and painful realizations about how hatred hides in plain sight. Roof's arrest gave authorities a body in custody. It did not yet give them the whole truth. In the earliest phase, one possible dead end lay in the oldest investigative habit after spectacular crimes, the search for a personal grievance that might explain the violence in familiar, containable terms. Detectives often ask whether the killer knew any of the victims, whether he had a specific quarrel, whether a private humiliation or interpersonal fixation set the act in motion. Such questions are reasonable because many killings do emerge from intimate conflict, but Mother Emanuel resisted that template almost at once. The victims were members of a Bible study group in a historic black church. The suspect was a white stranger who had entered, sat with them, and then shot them during closing prayer. Nothing in the initial evidence suggested a private feud between him and Reverend Clementa Pinckney, Myra Thompson, or anyone else in the room. That absence was itself a clue, but it also created a dead end of a different kind. Without a personal motive, the investigation had to move into the broader and more unsettling territory of ideology. And ideology is harder to narrate than grievance. It does not live in one insult, one breakup, one debt, or one family fracture. It lives in symbols, reading habits, resentments, fantasies, and permissions absorbed over time. Once Roof was in custody, investigators began hearing from him directly, and what emerged was not the language of personal vengeance, but the language of white supremacist fixation. The federal appellate record states that he admitted killing African Americans at Mother Emanuel, said his mission was to kill black people, and said he hoped to agitate race relations and start a race war. He also explained that he chose Mother Emanuel because of its historic importance because Charleston was a historic city, and because he believed he would find black parishioners there at Bible study. That confession was decisive, but it also shifted the investigative lens outward. If the motive was white supremacist violence aimed at symbolic impact, then detectives and federal agents had to ask what had fed that worldview. They examined his writings, digital footprint, photographs, statements, travel, weapon acquisition, and associations. This is where the investigation moved beyond the killer as an isolated body and into the broader ecology that had made his beliefs feel actionable to him. The dead end here was the comforting myth of the lone madman, the idea that such a crime could be sealed off from the culture that produced it by calling him aberrant and moving on. The evidence pushed in the opposite direction. Roof had absorbed racist propaganda and grievance narratives, displayed white supremacist symbols in photographs, and articulated beliefs that were not invented from nothing in the privacy of his own skull. Investigators also had to establish whether Roof truly acted alone in operational terms. After every major ideological attack, one of the first fears is accomplices. Did someone drive in, encourage in, supply the weapon, know the target, participate in planning? These questions matter not only for prosecution but for public safety. According to federal records and later reporting, authorities did not find evidence of co-conspirators in the actual church attack, and the case proceeded as one in which Roof acted alone in carrying out the murders. But arriving at that conclusion required ruling out alternatives. Every contact, message, purchase, and movement had to be checked against the possibility that this was not one man's operational plan but part of something larger. That process can feel like a dead end from the outside because it often produces no dramatic revelation, only a narrowing of the field. Yet such narrowing is essential. Investigators had to be certain that no second threat was still out there and that no collaborator had helped turn ideology into action. The absence of accomplices did not make the case simpler in moral terms. It only clarified the legal shape of responsibility. Another line of inquiry concerned the firearm itself and how Roof obtained it. Investigators found that he had acquired the Glock .45 caliber handgun used in the massacre after a background check process that should have raised disqualifying issues connected to a prior drug arrest. But the necessary records review was not completed before the sale went through. This became one of the most consequential non-obvious findings in the broader investigation. It did not alter Roof's guilt, but it exposed a systemic failure that intersected directly with the deaths at Mother Emanuel. Here the dead end was not ideological but bureaucratic. The law contained a mechanism meant to prevent prohibited purchasers from obtaining firearms, yet the mechanism failed because information was incomplete or not resolved within the statutory window. In one sense, this was not a dead end at all but a painfully concrete path to accountability beyond the shooter himself. In another sense, it was a dead end in the moral imagination of the public because discovering an administrative failure does not offer the emotional closure people often want after atrocity. It explains access, not hatred. It reveals negligence, not the full human source of evil. Still, investigators had to follow it because mass murder cases often uncover not just an offender but the gaps through which an offender moved. The symbolic dimension of the case created its own investigative challenge. Mother Emanuel was not merely a convenient site. It was one of the most historically important black churches in the country, deeply associated with black worship, resistance, and public life. Detectives and prosecutors therefore had to prove not only that Roof killed 9 people, but that he selected this church because of its racial and historical significance.